I don't know if you have all heard about it, but there's a pandemic going on. I think in life, there are always choices, but I think most of us are pretty universally in agreement that we'd like this thing to end. And that's kind of the basis on why I want to talk about the cycles of life today. The science of mind teaches us that it's our work to be aware of ourselves and our nature and to more deeply understand who we are and how life works for us to get the full benefit of it. Because it's a science. So by studying how life works, understanding the elements and the activities of life, we become more well-informed so that our choices are more well-informed. And that's kind of what I want to do today. I want to talk about this thing called life cycles and about how this idea of change, which we've already explored in our meditation this morning, but how the idea of change is so constant and that this urgency to create change or to avoid change, depending on the topic, is a part of life that is ours to explore and to have a deeper understanding of so that we can do our work. So I got into this idea of life cycles when I was doing my men's consciousness work. I hosted a number of men's gatherings in Western North Carolina, and the whole idea of that was to deepen a sense of what it means to be a man. And one of the books that I found along the way there was called The Seasons of a Man's Life. And it spoke of this idea of cycles. And it was completely focused on the idea of men's lives, but what I've discovered since, it's everybody's. There's no distinction there that I could see in how this was written or how this is explored, and I want to explore it with you this morning. But first, I want to share some words from a good teacher, a man named Dan Millman, who wrote The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. Very good. These are Dan's words. The world of nature moves in rhythms, patterns, and cycles. The passing of the seasons, the movement of the stars, the ebb and flow of the tides. The seasons do not push one another. Neither do clouds race the wind across the sky. All good things happen in their own good time, rising and falling and rising like ocean waves in the circles of time. Beautiful thought. And I think that's an important piece of wisdom for us, the idea that this pandemic that we're experiencing right now has its own cycle. It's doing what it needs to do, and our job is to be not afraid of it and not bewildered by it and not constricted by it, but to understand it so that we can do what is ours to do in the midst of it. Now, if you look at the general population, suicides are up, murders up, crimes of all kinds are up. I was reading an article that in San Francisco, burglaries are twice as many as they were just a year ago. All this has to do with people in a state of coping. Alcohol sales has gone through the roof. Everybody's trying to cope, and some of the choices that people are making aren't so great. So I have this conversation with you today so that we can more or less relax into this idea that things are on their perfect path, happening the way they're supposed to happen for us individually and collectively. Now, this idea of cycles of life, I have images of it, and what I see in this idea is that at the beginning of our lives, the cycles are smaller, mostly because we don't know as much about living on this human plane of existence. And then as we expand in our understanding, the cycles get bigger. So, and they're all connected, of course. They're not disconnected. So they get to a place where they look sort of like a spiral. And as you go through life, and another thing that I've discovered about these cycles is that the cycle it is thematic, but it also has components that seem to follow. So any time in your life that you think you've got something entirely handled and you never have to think about it again, guess what? you're going to go into that next cycle. And it's going to be a whole different look, but it's the same thing you're looking at. It's just different, but yet it's the same. So you get this idea of a spiral action of life where you're expanding in your understanding and you're moving upward. That's all very powerful and positive. But at the same time, you're still experiencing the elements of life as you go through this process. So understanding that and going back to this idea that came originally to me out of Seasons of a Man's Life, I want to explore the natural cycles that we as human beings go through. Now, there's two ways that we can do this. Let me get off that screen. So there's two ways to do this. You can do this as a self-exploration and say, okay, I remember that time in my life and how that worked and how this played out. Or you can look at other people in your life that may be in any of these particular cycles and recognize that what they're doing, even some of it that seems annoying or not very productive, is exactly where they need to be, because that's how life works in this human experience. So the people that research this and have come up with these ideas suggest that there are generally 10 cycles in a human life, and that they are generally about 7 years, but that's nothing specific. They can be shorter or longer, and everyone doesn't follow exactly the same format, but you'll recognize these things in your life. And so let's just go through them. We're going to go through them somewhat quickly, not too quickly, but enough just to get a sense of it. So where do we start? We start at birth. And from birth to age 7, we call that the formulation of foundational attitudes and key concepts. In other words, we're like sponges. We come into this plane old souls, spiritual beings, absolute, perfect in every way, but not necessarily familiar with this life that we're moving into. It's not like we've got the language. We don't. We get these sensations because we've moved from this state of pure spirit into this connection to a body that has needs, it has feelings, it has desires. And so we're suddenly engaged in all of this. We're in a state that moves from lightness to darkness, from cold to warm, and all of the in-between things of all of this. So we're trying to figure out how life works. And we, like sponges, are sucking up everything we can to understand this, about what's going on. We learn to speak. I'm not suggesting by 7 we have our full lexicon, but we certainly have a general understanding of whatever language we're experiencing in this lifetime. So we go through that, and the thing about this first stage that's really important, this first cycle, is that we're doing foundational work. These are things that basically will stay with you the rest of your life. Now, that doesn't mean you can't change your mind on some things. You can. But as we heard from Best of Barbara today, we create these patterns in our thinking. And a lot of those patterns are set up in this first 7 years. So if you've got a child or a grandchild that in your life, or other children that are in that range, they are busy getting their foundation set. That's what they're doing with everything in their lives. And it's a really important, fundamental time. Then we move to that 7 to 14-year-old period, which is called the cycle of intellectual development. That's where we start receiving impressions. We've actually started before, but where we're really focused on the impressions we get from our parents, from our siblings, from our other relatives, from our teachers, from society itself. And we start creating an understanding of how the world works and how we fit into it. Incredibly important period of time. Let's see. It's the time in which we understand or begin to understand how life really works and how we can influence it. Where we start having our early opinions and attitudes toward things. And by the time we've moved into our teens, we have a cycle of self-identity. This is an incredibly, what I have seen with 14, 15, 16-year-olds, that's when you think your parents are idiots. It's where you think everything they tell you is wrong. And the reason for that is that when we were that age, and everyone that is that age, is actually developing their independent thinking. It's where they don't have to ask to know what to think anymore. They will make their own mind up. We made our own minds up. That's where when we argued with parents, it's where we rebelled against things. It's a really important developmental stage for us where we begin to really seeing who we are in the mix of things and what we bring to the mix of life. This is the time when we get adventurous. It's the time when we do things that are daring. Some would say foolish. It's where we drive too fast. It's where we kind of throw caution to the wind just to see what our parameters are. You know, where's the edge here? And I'm not suggesting everybody does that, but it's a natural thing for people to go through that process because we want to see how much impact are we having on this thing called life. And it's an important developmental stage. The next one, of course, is the 21 to 28. We call that the cycle of maturity. Now, I wouldn't suggest that many of us in the room that are many years older than that find that people that are from 21 to 28 all that mature. However, it is that point where you start maturing in your life, where you start finding your place in the world, where you are career-oriented, where you're money-oriented, where you're stuff-oriented. It's where you start accumulating things in those years, where you want to drive that fancy car, where you want to have things that will impress. It's not that this is a right or wrong time. It's really just an establishing of how I can play in the world and what I can create in the world. It's a highly creative time, those 20s. It's the time where not everybody, obviously, but many people have their children is in those years where they have, it's often toward the end of this time is a time where we're really establishing ourselves in the world. So there is a level of maturity going on, even if it's not the final word on that. 28 to 35 is called the cycle of seeking. And that's where we go, really? Is this all it is? Is this all we get? And we start looking for something more. We start looking for why we're here. What's our purpose for being here? I've had the fast car. I've had this money, and I've kind of thrown it to the wind, and don't have much to show for it. So what's all this about? What are we doing in this life? And I remember this was the time where I went off on my walkabout, found myself in Australia, looking at my life going, what is this? I had by then a failed marriage. I had a son. What's this about? And I began finding answers. And then, of course, when I left Australia, I came right back, and within 3 days, I found my beautiful wife. She wasn't my wife right away, of course, but I knew she knew something that I wanted to know. And so I hung around and I listened, and I adapted, and I made that work for me. And this to me was a powerful time in my life where things really shifted. That seeking that came into my life out of me really made a difference. And I would bet that that's true for all of you as well. And if you know anybody that's in those years right now, that's what they're doing. It isn't always pretty. It isn't always easy, but it's important. And it's helpful to see that that's the time of life where we're seeking. That's the time of life where we often find our purpose too, where we begin to understand there's something greater than just acquiring things. And then, of course, 35 to 42, we call the cycle of spiritual abundance. And that's where we start having that understanding that life is more than the physicality around us, that there's something greater going on. And we start using that to create a richness in our lives. We look at our relationships and how important they can be, and we nurture them and we support them. And we do things that are going to help us have a sense of ourselves beyond our physical aspect, beyond our bodies and our acquisitions and the things that had been important to us up to that point. And we open up to the possibilities of life. And that's going to be on this piece of paper. It's also where we find our rich inner world. And we realize that there's things going on in the silence that make an amazing difference to us. It's when we start exploring our spiritual nature. I've had many people ask me or talk to me about how, wow, isn't it wonderful that we have kids 12 and under that are in this program where they're learning these principles. Here's what's going on, is that they're hearing them and those seeds are being planted in them. But then they're going to hit puberty and everything's going to change. But what's going to happen is, once they get to this age, or even before when they're in that seeking mode, something inside of them is going to come forth. It's going to germinate. And they're going to remember what they learned when they were little, but just put away. And that's going to come out of them. And that's why we don't see a whole lot of people in this movement younger than 35. I mean, we have them. That's no absolute. But generally, people that are ready for this interest are showing up in their 30s and 40s. Barbara would be an exception. She found it in her 20s. But I didn't. I was past 30 when I found it. So whatever your pathway is, this is an important state where you start establishing yourself as a spiritual being and living from that place. The next stage is 42 to 49, and that's a stage of material abundance. And this is where we kind of go back to the fact that we've found our course in life. Many of us have. This is what I want to do with my life. This is what's important to me. And it's often the time where our earning capacity is the largest, so that we are able to save money and create investments and do the things that we want to do. Now, I'm not saying that a 21-year-old can't do investments. Many do. But this is the area where things get settled and we get comfortable physically in who we are during these years that we're actually moving through life, doing the work that we've come to do. When we go from 49 to 56, we call this the cycle of spiritual inventory. And those are the years where we really look at ourselves from that spiritual perspective to see what we've accomplished in our lives. I remember that I was in my 20s when I established my statement of purpose. But I was probably close to 50 when I looked back on my life and said, wow, you did that, when you were about 30, but you've always been on that path. It wasn't like when you create a statement of purpose that now you're going to do that. You've always been doing it. It's just that you gave it words at that point. And that gives you a reflective moment to look back on your life and go, yes, I've been on this path, doing this work, finding my way. And it has worked out. So that in taking that inventory, we have a sense that this life thing is really working out. It has worked out for us. And that's a good thing. It's where we really get that our life experiences have been gifts to us, and it's where we find contentment in our journey. So from this point to our final cycle, there's one more beyond this. Cycle of purpose. Cycle of purpose is when we realize that we are making a difference on the planet. It's that place where we have established wisdom and understanding, and we share it with the world. Now, some people share it with thousands, possibly millions of people, but perhaps more likely, you shared it with a close cadre of friends or relatives or people who were important to you. And that by doing that, you're doing your part. You're touching those lives with the wisdom that you've attained over the years. It's your time to give back. It's your time to know who you are and to share that light with the world, that light I talk about every Sunday. When we choose to do this work, we're energized by it. So even though we've moved into right about our retirement age, for some people. Some people work way past that. But we've moved into a time where the pressures of life from our careers and such maybe aren't as strong, so that our energies now can go into these other avenues, these other ways of touching people in meaningful ways. It's our give back time. And then the final one, cycle of peace and completion. Now, no one's suggesting that this is a 7-year cycle that goes from 63 to 70 and then you're done. We know that people can live well beyond that, but in this construct that I'm talking about this morning, the idea here is that if you've done your work and gone through these cycles of development and understanding and action in your life, that what you're left with is a sense that you've accomplished good things, that you've touched hearts and lives, that you've made a difference. And that brings a sense of peace. And from that place of peace and understanding, there's a sense that this was worth all that it took to do it. All these years, all the drama, all the things that seemed like they didn't work out at the time, but they added to this thing called life. You know, anyone that ends a relationship calls it a failure. Most people do. But the truth is that relationship existed for a reason. It existed for a purpose in your life. And if you leave it and say it was awful and terrible, then you don't get the gifts of it. And it's by this time in your life that you can reflect back on relationships, on career changes, on places in the world that you've lived, things that you've seen and done, and say, look how it all fits together. Look how well it went. Look how wonderful it was. Yeah, there were hard times, but that's the nature of life. Sometimes it's hard. But the fact is that we get the benefit of that no matter what. And then we prepare for completion. And what I've seen is that and I don't want to indict anybody, but what I've seen in people is that people that can't find that peace, go ahead and use this time to leave. It's not wrong. It's not wrong. They completed their life the way they were meant to. And then there are others that find that sense of peace and want to stick around for a while. And that's good too. But there's no bad or wrong or right or anything else about this. This is all simply the way people choose to live their lives. And these are the 10 cycles that people generally go through. Now, I don't want to suggest to you that these cycles are the only cycles in your life. This is just one way to perceive it. The truth is that you have cycles going all the time. You have your rhythms. You have your flow in your life. And the important thing about that is as we move from one cycle to the next, to not do it with any kind of sense that something is wrong or bad. Sometimes we have to let go. And we have to learn how to let go. And sometimes we have to learn how to embrace. And it usually happens progressively in that order, that we let go and then we embrace something new. Oftentimes we don't even know what we're going to get when we do that. One thing that occurred to me as I was working on this message was that thinking back, it can't be an accident that societally we went through this kind of a pandemic in the world 102 years ago. Can't be an accident that was a century between these events, between the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919 and COVID-19 of 2020 and 2021. That's no accident. But if you look at history and what happened back then, once that thing was over and all those that had made their transition out of that, the world started fresh. What was it called? It was called the Roaring '20s. So it makes me think that maybe we got a big party coming. But regardless of what it looks like, it's going to be okay. Whatever that new normal becomes, we're going to be okay. And life's going to continue being good if we choose good. This is not the end. This is simply a cycle. And when we complete it, something more wonderful will happen. So now I want to share some words of wisdom from some great thinkers. This one from Eckhart Tolle. There are cycles of success when things come to you and you thrive, and cycles of failure when things wither and disintegrate. And you have to let them go in order to make room for new things to arise or for transformation to happen. If you cling and resist at that point, it means you are refusing to go with the flow of life, and you will suffer. It is not true that the up cycle is good and the down cycle is bad, except in the mind's judgment. Growth is important, but nothing can grow forever. Dissolution is needed for growth to happen. One cannot exist without the other. And we are simply in a time of dissolution, preparing ourselves for the next great moving forward of our lives. This is Bronnie Ware, an Australian author. Trust in the cycles of life. There is a place in your journey for what is currently unfolding. That sounds like good advice to me. And finally, from the wisdom of Kahlil Gibran, in every winter's heart lies a quivering spring, and behind the veil of each night waits a smiling dawn. So let us take that as where we are going and what is happening, that we move from that winter into a quivering spring, and that we accept that there is a smiling dawn that awaits us. I love you very much. Use this information well. Thank you.